And we have designed it in a manner in which we begin with a master class on economics. And we've had that master class on economics by Professor Amit S Ray for faculty in the last week of February. And we had one for students of Vishwa Bharati and Sister Nivedita University and Women's College Kolkata. And it's been a delight listening to Professor Amit S Ray. And within 1 hour, he manages to put everything that you can speak about to development. And every time, we are in awe at the end of the class. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Amit S Ray, who's the Professor of Economics, Center for International Trade and Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Amit S Ray was educated at Presidency College, Calcutta, and the University of Oxford, from where he received his DPhil in economics in 1988. Professor Ray joined JNU as associate professor in 1995 and became professor with effect from January 2000. In between, he's been the director, Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum during 2013-2016, and chair professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi during 2008 to 2010. Prior to joining JNU, he held teaching and research positions at premier universities and institutions in India and abroad, including Oxford University Institute of Economics and Statistics, International Food Policy Research Institute, which is at Washington, D.C., University of Calcutta, and the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. He was also elected a fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health, London in 2007. As you can understand, I don't want to take any more of his time introducing him, so I don't want to come between you and Professor Amit S Ray. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I have to begin with an apology to all students who are attending, and especially after this flamboyant introduction, you must be having very high hopes. But I must confess that my performance today would not be as good. That's because I have been performing this act continuously over the last 2 weeks. And as you know, a performer, even if one is a sitar artist, we never play the same, would never play the same raga every time he is invited to talk. No, I was hell-bent on not speaking, but my very good friend, the Honorable President of the Kolkata Press Club, prevailed on me and insisted that I speak. So with due apologies to all of you, I know expectations have been built up. And I could see it. My first lecture I enjoyed. My second lecture I couldn't finish and I stopped. I had to stop. And I don't know what's going to happen on the third lecture. So with this, and I hope there'll be no fourth lecture on the same topic, because we are not robots. We can't function like this. It's not a record player that we kind of play. So with all this and due apology, let me begin. And I was listening to the inaugural session a little bit here and there. I thought maybe this time I'll turn it around a bit with the permission of the organizers, Mr. Shur and Ms. Bardhan, if I may be allowed to twist it around a bit. And I'll try to cover the same content, but in a slightly different manner. So let me begin with what I perceive to be a major example of the process of development of mankind. Think of, please go back to thousands of years back, thousands and, centuries back, when we were inhabited by men and women who were essentially operating in a hunting-gathering society. So think of that state where you could get whatever you wanted or whatever you needed from the bounties of nature. You would go and pluck the fruits, you would kill animals, you would fish in the streams and seas and rivers, and you would be satisfied. You would use natural, materials, resources to cover yourself, and you were satisfied. So that was one state of development of the hunting-gathering society. Now, what happened? As the population of human beings expanding, there was pressure on Mother Nature. So they could feel that, they had to produce more. So it was not enough just to go and pluck the flowers, and it was not enough, they needed certain tools, possibly to be more effective in hunting animals. So what did they do? They started discovering, very simple tools to kill animals, maybe spears and arrows and what have you. So now, from a purely labor-driven process of production, where labor inputs were applied to natural resources to extract the goods and services that you needed, you are adding something called capital in the form of instruments. Now, in order to build the capital, how did this come about? You have to release some labor. You have to release some labor from the day-to-day hunting and gathering and activities. And these people should be able to think, come up with ideas, and then they should be able to build these simple implements which would augment productivity, and they were enjoying more and more bounties of nature with this. So that's a small step towards greater prosperity. So understand this as a process of development. So capital actually was facilitating this tiny mini move towards a more prosperous society in the hunting gathering ages. Now what happened? From the hunting gathering society, even with spears and arrows, resources were proving to be a constraint. And I would think one of the most important paradigmatic shift in the process of development of mankind was the movement from hunting-gathering society to settled agriculture and cattle rearing. So people realize that you don't have to just go and pluck flowers from nature, pluck fruits from nature and use whatever is being produced naturally. You can actually cultivate. You can cultivate your grains, you can cultivate your fruits, you can have orchards, you can have fields of, to produce your corn and other grains, and you can also rear cattle. So you don't have to keep on hunting. You can rear goats and camels and cows and sheep. So these would all add up to a more prosperous human society. So now, what was it that entailed that paradigmatic shift in the development process? So you are moving from a society which was very primitive, hunting gathering with simple tools, into settled agriculture. Now that required many changes to be taking place. One of the clear changes that required was change in the institutions or change in the rules of the game prevalent in society. And one of the most important institutions that started with the advent, with the introduction of this settled agricultural society was, somebody's raising hands, was the institution of property rights. Now you must understand that earlier there was no sense of individual ownership of property. So if there are fruits in the forest, anybody can have it. You just have to put your labor to pluck it and eat it. But now you are putting in your effort to have crops produced, and so you are putting in your effort for maybe 3 months, 6 months, and then you get the crops out. Now this crop has been produced by individual effort or maybe maybe the effort of a group of people. So this group of people would obviously claim ownership of those crops. That's the beginning of individual property rights, institution of individual property rights creeping in. Why? Because otherwise nobody will produce anything. Because if I produce and everybody thinks, oh, hey, there are plenty of grains being produced, I can also go and cut it and have it. No. So that's the whole idea of the process of the paradigm shift that happened in development. It had to be accompanied with a process of change in the institutional structure of property rights. So first, property rights on cattle. So if I am raising sheep or cow, I claim ownership of these animals. And second, ownership on standing crops. These were the first two items on which property rights, individual property rights, were assigned by society. And if you have property rights, what do you mean by individual property rights? What is that institution? That institution ensures that a society guarantees that this is your property, nobody is allowed to touch it. So you would have to have legal enforcement of that. Now, in order to enforce it, you have to have a mental frame or a culture or value system where you should be taught that stealing is wrong. So no wonder, if you look at the history of religion, right from the initial days, in almost every religion, thou shalt not steal is a common sermon. That is the kind of value system or culture that had to come commensurate with the paradigm shift in the process of development. So now I would visualize development as standing on four pillars. The first pillar is obviously resources. And as I said, resources could be your natural resources like land, forests, and what have you. Then labor resources, which was extremely important in the early phases of the hunting-gathering society. Then capital resources, and then knowledge resources. All these resources are important. Okay, and now many of these resources are not natural. They have to be actually developed. Capital resources, knowledge resources, you need investments to augment these resources. Natural resources, possibly, you cannot do much to change it. You can do a little bit to change it, but not much. I mean, you can have different sources of energy. That is knowledge resource augmenting. Solar energy, is a resource, is a natural resource, but it was never discovered earlier. So you need knowledge resource to augment natural resources. Now, the second pillar is having the resources, but you have to convert these resources into goods and services. That's the second pillar, which is technology. That is the second pillar, which gives you the knowledge of how to combine these resources to convert them into goods and services. And this is where, again, the role of knowledge comes in, because technology is continuously changing, improving. So you would have newer and newer methods of combining resources to augment your goods and services that are available. So therefore, first resource, second is technology. These are the two core pillars, and that completes the economic subsystem of a society. But as I explained, the economic subsystem is not enough. You would have to have a commensurate social subsystem consisting of institutions, which are basically the rules and the laws. Like the example I gave, you needed an institution of property right very clearly instated in society in order for the paradigm shift in development from hunting gathering to settled agriculture. In many cases, this shift was extremely slow. For instance, Spain, for instance, had a nomadic culture for a very, very long time. So they were never being pushed, it was very slow for the institution to change, into this institutional, structure of individual property rights. So that's the third pillar, which is a part of the social subsystem. And the fourth pillar, as I said, the institutions can by themselves would be absolutely useless if it's not with the value system of the culture of the society. How can an institution survive if society, the men and women of the society, they don't, subscribe to it. They don't agree to it, Anything can be an institution. I'm not talking about economics right now. For instance, marriage is an institution. Because society believes that a man and a woman can only stay together and procreate and have children only if they're married. Okay, so marriage is an institution, which of course gets changed. So therefore, all these four pillars are continuously evolving with the process of economic development. As human society develops, resources keep on changing, technology keeps on changing, institutions keep on changing, and the value system and culture keeps on changing. So, and please do appreciate that these are not standalone pillars. They reinforce each other. They affect each other. So in a sense, these four pillars co-evolve with the process of economic development. Now, with this broad framework in mind, let us try to define, I have been rather vague in terms of defining what is economic development. And I said that, you need to be prosperous. A hunting gathering society, prosperity is what? Having more food, more weapons to kill, more implements to kill animals, more basic clothes covering or whatever, some natural shelter. These are indicators of your prosperity. And that, in a broad sense, reflect development. But in a modern society, of course, we'll have to be a little more specific. So if it is indeed the goods and services at the disposal of a society that indicates development, then economic development becomes synonymous with a concept called the gross domestic product, GDP of a country. And I must tell you, this was the prevailing concept for a very long time. Now, I would like now to challenge this concept, although economists more or less agree that that's, for lack of any other better indicator, let's work with, GDP or national income as the indicator of prosperity of a society or a nation. Let me first try to understand what the problem is. In popular discourse, as you have all seen, everybody talks about development, particularly in a federal structure where each state will try to showcase its performance in terms of certain areas of development. So some states, particularly as elections come closer, you will see huge advertisements, full-fledged advertisements of each state government showcasing what they have done. Some states would, flaunt their achievement in terms of attracting lots of investment as their, development performance. Other states would say, we have done the best in terms of education and health. Some states would say, we have the most peaceful society, very little, we are the best in crime rate, we are the best in security. Some states would say, yet others would say, no, we have produced we have the largest per capita state GDP. Now, everybody is right. These are all competing statements that are factually correct. But it does not, but it's very confusing because it does not give the full picture of how we should visualize development. It's almost like, this is the anecdote I'm using for the third time, the 6 blind men and the elephant. Everybody is looking at one part and thinking how to describe an elephant. They are all correct, but none of them gets the one is able to provide a full, complete picture of what the elephant looks like. That is the purpose of this lecture. So I would try to make you have a broad idea of this concept of development. What exactly should be development? In order to do that, let me delve a little deeper into the history of how the concept of development evolved in economic theory. Now, although not in so many words, but the concept was rooted in the writings of the classical economic writers like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx. All of them talked about prosperity of societies. Adam Smith's book is called The Wealth of the Nations, okay? And all of them tried to give their own perspective or own understanding of how a society or how an economy becomes more and more prosperous. And back of their mind, they always had the gross national product or the gross domestic product, the size of the pie, as the indicator of development. And they, of course, had a very, very similar, although they are very different in their model construction and conclusions, but they had a very similar approach. All of them believed in industrialization-led development. And so it was like, as industry developed, they were all talking about the capitalistic development process, where surplus would be reinvested and the modern sector or the capitalist sector would keep on expanding and productivity would keep on rising, and hence a society would go to higher and higher levels of output. Now, actual focus on development or economic development, or let me put it this way, the emergence of development economics as a distinct subdiscipline of economics emerged only in the post-colonial era in the 50s and 60s. This huge tract of the globe where we had these extremely poor, underdeveloped nations getting independent, newly independent nations, which were under colonial rule in the past. How are they going to achieve prosperity? That was the focus of the subdiscipline of development economics. Now, even then, by and large, the focus or the contours of this subdiscipline revolved around the concept of GDP and growth of the GDP. So economic growth and economic development were more or less used synonymously in this literature to begin with. Now, actually, that's problematic, because although if we want to use development as a benchmark of your prosperity, then ideally we should think of something that measures quality of life. Now, development, the process of development must therefore imply improvement in living conditions of individuals and the society as a whole. If living conditions are not improving, then we can hardly call it development, no matter how much our per capita GDP is. All right. Apart from this, per capita GDP has certain inherent limitations, which, there are many, and maybe I'll just mention a few. For instance, it does not, but suppose if you want to see how much I have produced this year, okay, this country has produced this year. Now, that doesn't mean that this whole amount can be used for my prosperity, used to consume for my prosperity, because there is a trade-off between present versus future consumption. Even if I, provide for depreciation to keep the capital stock intact, what I'm assuming is, this same thing would remain forever. But then maybe I would like to have more in future. I don't want to get stuck here. So, this is a problem of using GDP as a measure. Second, there are problems of inter-country comparison of living standards. So, if you say that India's per capita income is, say, 1/10 of one of the Western nations, does it mean that an average Indian is 1/10 worse off. His quality of life is 1/10 of that in that other country. Or in other words, the average individual in the other country is 10 times better off, 10 times better quality of life. Not necessarily. Because if we convert the Indian GDP into US, to take the example of USA, for instance, if an average Indian has $100 in his pocket in the streets of Calcutta, for instance, that is about 7,500 rupees. Now, having 7,500 rupees in the pocket, Calcutta, and having $100, a bill of $100 in New York, would mean very different things. Because $100 will not go too far. Whereas 7,500 rupees can, you can dine at a fancy restaurant, for instance, a meal for 4. And you can do this, you can do that. Whereas $100, even to take a bus ride, you might have to pay $3, $4, $5, So therefore, what $100, how far it goes in America may be very different from how far it goes in India. Therefore, we cannot compare $100 with 7,500 rupees and say that this is equivalent quality of life. So there is a concept of purchasing power parity, which basically says that if we identify a standard basket of goods which are required in the two societies, and how much do you need to spend in Indian rupees in India for that, and how much you need to spend in US dollars in US for that, and compare that to, you get a rate which is known as the purchasing power parity rate. So in PPP terms, maybe Indian rupees would be possibly not 75 rupees per dollar, but maybe 30 rupees a dollar or 25 rupees a dollar or whatever. I'm just guessing. Don't take these numbers literally. I have not come with the World Bank report saying what the PPP exchange rates are. I'm just giving you the example. So therefore, there are. So if you want to make interpercent, but then the problem is, how do you come up with the standard basket? What is required? In America, you might require heating, which is essential. Otherwise, in the freezing winters in the streets of Chicago, you would die. Whereas here, you don't need that. So, requirements. So it's very problematic, in that sense. But still, people have come up with this comparison. Then, of course, GDP ignores all non-market transactions. So anything that is not marketed is not part of the GDP accounting. For instance, the kind of things, if I cook my own meal, that's not a part of GDP. But if I hire a cook, the income of that cook gets added to the GDP. So therefore, these are problems. There are societies where many of these things are, self-consumed and, self-provided. Whereas, in other societies, there are markets and institutions. For instance, caregiving is extremely marketized and institutionalized in certain societies, and obviously not so much in another society. And non-market transactions don't enter the GDP, so that does not reflect quality of life necessarily. And finally, there are many others, but the fourth one that I would like to highlight is it gives an average. When you talk about GDP per capita, it talks about an average individual in a society, but it doesn't talk about the distribution. So if a society, two societies with the same average per capita GDP might have very different levels of inequalities. So in a very unequal society, the quality of life may not be as good as it is in a kind of a relatively society. And there are many things, associated with inequality. Society may be more prone to crime, more prone to violence, an unequal society. So therefore, all this will add to your quality of life. And I'm going to talk about it before I end this lecture. I'm going to talk about each of this. So therefore, let's understand that although it's a workable way of looking at economic development, GDP is far from being perfect as an indicator of quality of life, if that is how we define development. Now, unfortunately, the development literature till the 60s and 70s were exclusively focusing on how fast the GDP can grow for these underdeveloped countries, and that was the sole preoccupation of development economy. Do you want to need more savings? You need to inject more aid. But the whole idea was to maximize the size of the cake or increase the size of the pie. And most of it was through industrialization-led development. In fact, there is a very well-known literature in development which was popularized by Hollis, Chenery, and Serquin in 1975 in a very well-known book, which identified development as a process of structural change. And it said that every country, even those which were developed at that point in time, had to go through a structural change. And that structural change was, initially, it would be an agriculture-dominated society economy. And then from agriculture, it would become a more manufacturing or industry-dominated economy. And then finally, at the third stage of development, it would be a service-dominated economy. That was the accepted, kind of wisdom that, okay, it is. So for the newly independent developing countries, industrialization was the motto, so you have to industrialize to develop, to increase the size of our GDP, to increase our economic growth. But of course, that structural change view has also been challenged, because as we know, when we look at, at this point, if you look at India's, change in the structural composition of its economy, India never, went from a predominantly agricultural to a predominantly industrial society. From a predominant agriculture, it went to a predominantly service-driven society. And industry remained kind of in between, more or less there, So therefore, people started challenging this conventional view that let us forget about trying to push development policy solely in terms of industrialization to achieve economic growth. So now in the 70s, all these, wariness about the conventional thinking on development was coming up, and the World Bank, this was the Robert McNamara period of the World Bank. He was the one, as a multilateral agency, he clearly, sort of envisioned that development policy can no longer be about maximizing growth and macroeconomic adjustments. We'll have to look at poverty. So a direct approach to reduce poverty is of utmost importance for a development policymakers. So you see a clear shift in the policy making. So that prompted a lot of literature, a lot of studies on how to measure poverty, how do we know which one is more poor, and there are plenty of studies trying to understand the extent of poverty of a country. The basic idea is you define a poverty line in terms of the income that you require for your survival. Okay, so if there is a standard basket of goods, to survive, just to survive, how much money do you need? That should be your income. If it falls below, then you are poor. If you are above, then you are no longer poor. So, there are controversies about how to, define the poverty line. But broadly speaking, this is the concept of defining a poverty line. And poverty was measured as the number of poor or number of people falling below the poverty line. There are problems with it also, because, if the poverty line is say 100 and you are say at 95, you are poor. But poverty line is 100 and you are at 30, you are poor. Both of you can't be regarded as equally poor. But in terms of the number count, head count, it's the same. So it doesn't matter whether you are at 30 or whether you are at 95. So the gap is important. So there is a second, approach which tries to look at the gap. And, there are various concepts that were used, so that you should be able to come up with a measure of poverty where, suppose if poverty is, determined only by head count, then every policymaker would say, okay, the people who are just at 95, give them 5 rupees and they all become 100. So we would reduce the number of poor. Let us forget about the really poor ones. That's very perverse, isn't it? But on paper, it will look that poverty has improved. Poverty head count measure has improved. So there are many such problems like this, which you will have to really encounter and tackle. Now, from poverty and trying to move the poor out through income transfers or ensuring income, then there was another school of thought which said, look, if you really want to make a difference to the quality of life of the people in these underdeveloped countries, why don't we provide them with the basic needs? Why don't we have a policy that ensures that these basic needs are met for all, no matter whether you are poor or rich? So therefore, what is after all the poverty line? It's your survival. So what are the basic needs? Food, housing, clothing, and some public services. So there was this another approach to development policy which focused on the basic needs approach. Now, subsequently, you can see that how the disillusionment has come. So to focus only on the macro parameters of economic growth and GDP. So now from there, actually we move on to a very interesting development of defining economic development. And this initiative was adopted by the UNDP. And they came up with what is known as the Human Development Indicator. And what is that? It was felt that there are three basic components or three basic parameters that define your quality of life. So apart from material prosperity, which you can proxy in terms of your, per capita GDP, you need education and you need health. So if you can devise an indicator which looks at these three parameters and comes up with an index, then you can define how developed a society is. So that was the first step of moving towards a more, focused and comprehensive approach towards development in terms of just three parameters: health, education, and material prosperity. But actually, the whole idea was rooted in the philosophy of development, which was popularized by Professor Amartya Sen, who talked about development as freedom, development as capabilities. So now let me try to explain this a bit, because this is important for you as development journalists. So the basic underlying approach is that development does not exclusively consist of the goods and services at your disposal that you can consume. Rather, it consists of the ability to do certain things. Okay? So for instance, instead of thinking of education as a good that is consumed, so therefore you provide education as a basic need because you need education. No, education serves a purpose. Education is considered as an input enabling a person to live a meaningful and purposeful life. So it helps you to do certain things. Okay? So it makes you capable of doing certain things. So development should therefore be focused on creating these capabilities of people to do or to be, to be happy or to do work, to be able to study. So these are the capabilities. Now, you may have the capabilities, but you may not have the freedom to do what you want. Okay? So what does that mean? I'll give you an example. Often a child is forced to do engineering. They're forced to do economics and this and that. You are capable of doing lovely paintings. You are capable of doing, fine arts, drama. But our society does not permit that often. So even if you are capable, particularly in a society rife with discrimination, not every individual will have the freedom to choose the way they want to live. Now that, of course, could be development. A motto of development should be to ensure that not only you can nurture your capabilities, but also to ensure that you are free to choose, free to do whatever you want to pursue. So that's the core philosophy behind which the new conceptualization of development began. And the human development is just a first step towards this, because they felt that, having access to education and having access to health and to some degree of material prosperity are the three basic components to nurture these capabilities and freedom. Okay. Now, of course, there were, this was further augmented, policymakers, again, the UN said that, okay, fine, enough is enough. We need to have very specific targets to fulfill. So they came up with the Millennium Development Goals, which sort of set specific targets for countries to, achieve in terms of, and then they said that, forget about this, broad development macro policies. You try to achieve each of these targets through specific targeted policy interventions. And these, so the MDGs that was signed in 2000, had 8 goals with 21 targets. And these 8 goals, included eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality and empowerment of women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, malaria, etc. Ensure environmental sustainability and develop global partnership for development. So essentially the whole idea, you can see now, policymakers were more directly involved in achieving targets that would create or nurture this sort of concept of creating capabilities and freedom. Now, of course, what happened with the Millennium Development Goals? They were supposed to be, fulfilled, but countries were lagging behind. So in 2015, the UN came and said, no, these were, actually sort of kind of vague, and it was not very clearly laid out. So they had a huge rounds of consultation, and they came up with the Sustainable Development Goals, which had many more targets. Which had like 17 goals and numerous targets. And there, anybody and everybody started putting in goals. Like if you see, the SDGs would have, no poverty, zero hunger, etc. Of course, is there. But then they would have industry, innovation, infrastructure, reduced inequality, which is fine, responsible climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, institutions. Everything is part of, the Sustainable Development Goals, and with very, very specific micro targets. All right, that we'll have to do this. Now, I don't want to, you can open the UNDP website and get all the goals, and let me not talk about it, but let me end this lecture by actually seeing how the concept of capabilities of freedom was actually converted into a more measurable conceptualization of development as a multi-dimensional concept. And this was done by the Stiglitz Commission, which was sort of a commission that was constituted in February 2008 by the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy, with Joseph Stiglitz as the chair and Amartya Sen and Jean-Paul Fitoussi as members. And they came up with a fantastic report. I think to this date, that is one of the most comprehensive, depiction of what development entails. They said, they identified 9 dimensions of development. And they said that, of course, the first dimension is material prosperity, because you need material prosperity in order to develop. That is one of the key dimensions of development. Their whole idea was rooted in, as I said, capabilities and freedom. All right. But here they said that material prosperity should not be, sort of, seen as just GDP per capita, Material prosperity would include almost anything that you can think of that improves your material comfort. You know, the quality of housing in a society, whether you have drinking water, whether you have roads, you have good sanitation facilities, how well you are connected, you know, teleconnectivity, communications network, you know, internet connectivity. These are all factors that contribute to your well-being. Or, you know, if you are not connected in the net, then clearly your quality of life will never be, you will not be capable of doing certain things that you would like to do. All right. And of course, GDP per capita, absence of poverty, hunger, these are very different, very important dimensions of material prosperity. So now they took a kind of a holistic look on material prosperity, identified these various parameters. Then the second dimension they said was health. And here, you know, I am actually extremely, you know, happy to see that they actually considered this to be the second most important dimension. Actually, if you remember, in our great epic Mahabharata, when Yaksha asked Yudhishthir, what is the greatest gift of all? What is the greatest asset of all for human beings? The reply was health. What a profound statement. We are all enjoying this lecture because we are healthy. Without good health, nothing matters. You know, you may be highly materially prosperous, but health is extremely important, and health can be manifest. So that's one of the most important dimensions of quality of life, apart from material prosperity. So, and that can be again, you know, measured through various manners, you know, health outcomes like mortality, morbidity, longevity, and also health inputs like health infrastructure, health expenditure, nutritional intake, and so on and so forth. The third important dimension is knowledge and education. Again, this is one dimension which is extremely powerful, because if you think of the four pillars of development, the technology pillar is nothing but knowledge. And unless you are educated, you will not be able to be part of that knowledge-driven development paradigm that we are now seeing. We are now entered a society, you know, we are no longer an agricultural society, we are no longer a society driven by capital. We are a society which is driven by knowledge. And this is just not now. There is a path-breaking article by Robert Solow, Nobel laureate, you know, in 1957, where he showed that between 1900 and 1950, contrary to popular belief, the fastest growing country of the world was America. And contrary to popular belief, the per capita manufacturing GDP of America was not being driven by its capital accumulation. Of course, only 1/8 was explained by capital accumulation. And the remaining 7/8 of the growth was being explained by technical progress. What is technical progress? New knowledge. So at that point, the whole idea was you need investment, you need capital. That was the capitalistic industrialization led development that people had been used to thinking. Solow's finding brought down a very important parameter of growth, which is technology, which is knowledge. So therefore, we cannot deny that knowledge and education as one of the most important enabling parameters of development. Knowledge and education can be measured again through a lot of, I don't have the time to go into this. I have only 5 more minutes. So, and I'd like to end at least a couple of minutes before. So the fourth dimension, you know, which they mention in the Stiglitz Commission is personal activities. Now, you may be very prosperous, healthy, educated, but think of the life of a young analytics employee in the IT sector in Bangalore. Goes to office in the morning, comes back late at night, sleeps again, goes to office in the morning, has hardly any time for himself. So a society that does not foster any time to themselves, in fact, Japan, people work so hard that, there is very little socialization, I'm told. Okay. So, and that will tell on your quality of life. So personal activities and various activities included under this domain include, whether you have decent paid work. Decent, is the word. Unpaid, do you have to do unpaid work somewhere? How much do you have to commute? How much leisure time do you have to yourself? These would all be part of your development process. Unfortunately, this dimension is very difficult to measure. Okay, it's almost impossible to measure. The fifth dimension is political voice and governance. Political ambience and governance structure have an important role to play in shaping quality of life. We all know that. Ability to participate in political discourses and public policy making, to express dissent, as well as to speak up against the authority on matters that one perceives to be wrong or to be important. This is what a democracy is all about. So all aspects of political are aspects of political freedom which would have a positive value in themselves, apart from their instrumental role in enabling better decision making and outcomes. So political freedom is important. Political voice is important. Now, also important is governance. How reliable is the government? Is it corruption free? How well is your judiciary? And whether, if you feel that you've been wronged, do you have ways and means to, take action or seek redressal? These are all elements of the fifth dimension, which is political voice and governance. The sixth dimension talks about social connections. And I was talking about Japan. People are extremely isolated there. So, how much of social activities do you have? How much of clubs? If you are isolated, it has been noted that if you look at the Scandinavian countries, they're extremely prosperous, very high per capita incomes. But, they're depression prone. There is a very high suicide rates there. So, if you are isolated, you would obviously not have that quality of life. So, how many close friends you have? Are you involved with religious, cultural, voluntary or political organizations? Are you involved in charities? How strong is your family ties? Joint family structure is good and bad. The breaking up of the joint family structure can also create havoc in terms of your quality of life, Then marital stability, social isolation in terms of suicides. These are all indicators of the sixth dimension, which is social connection. The seventh dimension is environment, which we all know about. We'll have to live, we can keep on producing, but if we pollute the world, if we extract all our resources, we leave nothing. The Mother Earth will just collapse at some point, So therefore, this is definitely, in Delhi, in November and December, it's impossible to live because of the extreme high degree of pollution. With the large number of vehicles, is that a indicator of development? Of course. So many people are prosperous. There are so many cars flying, but it's really not adding up to the quality of life. So therefore, development is not a unidirectional, linear, kind of a concept. Eighth dimension is personal security. If it's crime free, if it's, there are less accidents, less violence, less riots, how secure and safe you are personally. That's the eighth dimension. The ninth dimension talks about economic security. Now here, I must add that economic security doesn't mean that you earn a lot of money. You may be earning a lot of money, but if you are still uncertain about your future, if you lose your job, then, and there is no economic security. There are countries with very sound social security systems which you can fall back on. But here, when we talk about, farmers' crop failure, it's suicides, When we say that, farmers cannot repay their loans, they end up in suicides because there is no economic security. And so that, of course, and it would depend on how high is the unemployment rate. So if you lose a job, how easy is it to get another job? How much is your dependence on agriculture, which is inherently uncertain? How much of your workforce is in the informal sector with no formal job contracts? How much of your population is covered by social security? How much of your households are under debt? These are all parameters of economic insecurity. So the Stiglitz Commission is one piece of work that I would suggest all of you should read to get a holistic understanding of what development entails. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, as we say that if the master plays 500 times, it will be a different experience. So it's just 3. So it was as illuminating as the first one and the second one. Students, do you have any questions or do you have anything to ask, sir? Let me hear some voices. Are you there?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, can you suggest some good source for Stiglitz Commission?
You're muted. You're on mute, sir.
Yes, you can just give a search on the web, and say Stiglitz Commission, and he will come up with it. I'll give you the exact reference. Stiglitz. It's a report of the Commission on the measurement of economic performance. So, if you give a search, report of the Commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress by Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen. You just give these, then immediately the PDF report will come up in the net. Okay. So that's very easy to find.
Yes, sir.
And you found it, right? And if you want to read a book, then I normally don't prefer doing it, but this is a recent publication that that's one of my books, published by, I don't know whether it's visible. Is it visible? Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
What is economic development?
Yes. And this is published by Routledge, so if you give a search, I don't know whether this book is available online, but there is an Indian edition of it. This is published by Routledge, but this is the Routledge version. The Indian version is published by Social Science Press in Delhi. And that kind of covers, a somewhat, snapshot of the lecture that I gave you today.
Thank you so much, sir. Does anyone have any other question? Thank you for the question, Sushishmita. Anyone else?
I think people are a little overwhelmed with this condensed lecture, so let them, sort of assimilate it.
Thank you so much again, sir. As students know, this is being recorded, and we are sending all these individual lectures to you along with your certificate. So you will get this entire lecture on YouTube by day after tomorrow. Thank you again, sir, and we'll keep on, looking at you for future master classes as well. As of now, of course, Sneha will ensure that you're there for our SKBU and IIMC students as well on the 1st of April 2022. And hopefully, we'll
We will talk about that later. But thank you very much. So I can leave now, right? My session
Thank
is
you.
over. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.